So hi again, everyone. Welcome to today's Research Spotlight talk. We're broadcasting live here from the Yale Peabody Museum, which, as many of you know, is undergoing a lot of major renovations and is scheduled to be opening next spring. So stay tuned for those updates. But in the meantime, we're happy to at least be talking here from the physical museum. My name is Katrina Damrell. I'm a Master's of Environmental Management student at the Yale School of Environment. One second. Sorry, just getting technical difficulties for one moment. Do you need me to keep going? Or
Start over.
Start from the top? Hi, guys. Okay, ready? So hi everyone, welcome to today's Research Spotlight talk. We're broadcasting live from the Yale Ph.D. Museum, which, as many of you know, is undergoing some major renovations and is scheduled to open later in 2024 in the spring. And we look forward to inviting everybody back in person at that time. I'll introduce myself. I'm Katrina Damrell. I'm a Master's of Environmental Management student at the Yale School of Environment. I'm also the Research Spotlight Assistant at the Yale Peabody Museum. The Research Spotlight series is the Peabody's Graduate Student Speaker Series. We like to highlight different grad students who do their research in connection with the museum's collections. Before we get going, I just want to run over some quick housekeeping details. So because this is a Zoom webinar, we have disabled the chat function. So if you have any questions, use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of the window on your screen. And you can submit questions at any point during the webinar. That said, we typically do receive more questions than we can actually answer, so I apologize in advance if we don't get to your question. Also, Zoom does have a captioning option, which if you need that, you can go ahead on usually it's on the bottom right menu of your window, so feel free to use that. And yeah, with that, I'm ready to introduce our speaker today. We are joined here today with Liam Taylor, which welcome to come on up if you want, Liam. Yeah. Liam is a PhD candidate at Yale's Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. His work focuses on understanding juvenile bird behavior. Liam's grad research combines evolutionary theory, phylogenetics, and fieldwork to study how social development reshapes the life history and plumage of young birds, with a focus on colonial seabirds and Lechlean manakins. And his talk today explores the strange things that some birds need to do before they reproduce, from meeting a fishing buddy with potential benefits on a rocky island to finding a dance partner on a rainforest floor. And looking back through millions of years of evolution, Liam will explain to us and explore how behavioral, social, and sexual development continues to create challenges and opportunities for adolescent birds.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my own slides here. Try sharing your mic. And I'm unmuted. Looks pretty good. All right. Thanks for that introduction. Again, my name is Liam Taylor. I'm an ornithologist and an evolutionary biologist. Like Katrina said, I'm excited to be here broadcasting live from the renovated Peabody Museum in front of a wonderful live audience here just off screen, so that's fun too. And today I just want to tell a few stories about the unusual, the strange, the weird development of young birds. And of course, we're going to start with an insect. Once I get my clicker going here. When we think about development in animals, we tend to think about physical growth. So you might imagine a caterpillar metamorphosizing into a butterfly or a small fish growing into a bigger fish. And what it means, we tend to think, for an organism, an animal, to be an adult is to be physically mature, to be fully grown. And when you're an adult, that's when you start doing adult things like having babies. Of course, in humans, we know that things are a little bit more complicated. There is physical growth. I've gotten a little bit taller, but merely being physically mature isn't enough to be an adult. You need to act like an adult too. And it's not necessarily clear how that's going. But to be mature as a human, you need to act like an adult. That means that development has to do with more than just your body. It has to do with behavior and society. Today, my only goal is to get us all thinking about birds a little bit more like we think about humans. Because here's the deal. Birds grow to full size in their first year of life in almost every species of bird, big or small. There are a few exceptions. But by and large, it only takes most birds months or sometimes even just a few days to be fully physically grown after they hatch from an egg. But despite being physically mature, in a lot of species, a young bird won't start breeding for 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 years. So the first thing we can observe is in birds, there's a difference between being fully grown and reproduction. There's a difference between being adult size and being an adult. Today, I'm just going to walk through 2 stories about the kinds of things that young birds need to do to be a proper adult in their societies. Here are the stars of our show. On the left, we have a young American herring gull. On the right, we have a long-tailed manakin. I'm lucky enough to do some of my fieldwork in Canada with herring gulls. We'll talk about that. And really privileged to do some work with manakins in the Peabody's natural history collections as well as out in the field. We're going to start with a herring gull. What you're seeing all the way on the left is a young bird. That bird is about 12 months old in its first summer after hatch. You can see it's in its brown, shabby plumage, but comparing it to that bird in the back, it's about full size, and it reached that size only just a few months after hatching. It will take 3 or 4 years to look like the bird all the way on the right. This is a definitive adult breeding bird. This is what a breeding adult American herring gull looks like. In between, it's going to pass through a couple plumage stages like the one in the middle. The bird in the middle is about 3 years old. You can tell because of its distinct plumage qualities, it's got these streaks of brown in its gray wings and a black tail band and a little bit of black on the bill. So what does it take for this bird, 12 months old but fully grown, to become this bird, 4 or 5 years old and finally breeding? Why does it take this bird 4 years to start reproducing? If you dig through the literature, you'll see a lot of stories about this, about foraging. It's tough, as you can see, for a young gull to figure out how to find, capture, and handle food. Young gulls have a lot to do. They need to decide how they're going to forage. Do I eat off the back of a fishing boat? Do I eat at a dump? Do I forage for crabs in the intertidal? And then they need to develop those skills. They need to get better and better at foraging. Because to raise young, you need to both feed yourself and your offspring. Otherwise, it won't work no matter what, even if you're physically fully mature. There's some good data, especially from the 80s, about the ways that young herring gulls get better at foraging. On the x-axis, this horizontal axis, you're seeing older and older birds. All the way on the left is a 1-year-old bird, like the one in that really shabby plumage. All the way on the right are these 4-year-olds and older, these breeding adults. On the y-axis, you're seeing one of my favorite measurements of all time, swallows per 15 seconds. This is a measurement of how quickly herring gulls are developing the ability, how efficient they are at finding, capturing, and handling their food. And you can see that 1-year-old gulls are not very efficient at foraging. Older birds become much more efficient, and by the time they're at that age at first reproduction, by the time they're ready to begin breeding, they're also very efficient foragers. So this is one thing that a young herring gull needs to get better at. Once they are able to find enough food, eat enough food, feed themselves and their babies, then they can start actually producing babies. I wanted to learn more about the development of herring gulls, so I went to one of my favorite places in the world, Kent Island, right on the border between Maine and Canada. This is what Kent Island on the right here looks like from a satellite. Lovely island, about 2 miles north to south and 1 mile at its widest, east to west. This is the satellite view. This is the view from the beach. It's a lot of gulls sitting around. You can see 4 or 5 nests. You can see as the video plays, birds flying in, getting into little fights. There's a lot of posturing. There's a lot of tension. Once you start observing, you'll start to see a lot of complexity here. What I also saw when I went to the beach was even in this shot, there are 3 or 4 of those adolescent birds, those 3-year-old birds in the middle on the previous slide. These birds with these brown in the wings and silver on the back and the black tail band. Not all the way young, but not quite fully mature. These adolescent birds weren't breeding, So what were they doing? The first thing I did was something that for some reason people haven't done, which is just count which birds were at the breeding colony. On the x-axis, the horizontal axis here on the bottom, you're seeing the summers pass as herring gulls arrive on Kent Island and breed from June to July to August. On the y-axis, this is log scale. So you can think of 1 as about 10 birds, 2 as about 100 birds, and 3 as about 1,000 birds. When you count the number of these youngest birds and these really brown, shabby plumages, maybe 1 or 2 years old, there's a dozen or so of them. These are these brown lines all the way at the bottom. All the way at the top on this black line, there's thousands of these breeding adult birds, maybe 3,000 or 4,000. And in the middle, I observed something sort of new, which is hundreds of adolescent birds at this breeding colony. These are young birds returning to the colony. Now, there is no food at the colony. Birds, herring gulls, find their food in other places. Maybe out in the intertidal on the island, maybe way offshore, maybe on a neighboring island, maybe at a landfill somewhere miles away. But these adolescent birds were on the colony even though they hadn't started breeding. So what are they doing? I did another thing, which for some reason people haven't done, which is count where the birds are. You can split an island like Kent Island into 2 different kinds of areas. On the one hand, you have non-territorial areas, out on the beach, in the open space, on the shoreline, out in the intertidal, out swimming offshore. And then on these burns, as you approach the meadow at the center of the island, that's where all the nesting birds are. That's where birds have their territories. That's where they raise their young. That's where they fight with other birds and defend their nest sites. If you count which birds are in the non-territorial and which birds are in the territorial areas, you see that these youngest birds, the really brown, shabby young ones, about 1 or 2 years old, are almost all out in the non-territorial areas. And that the oldest birds, the definitive breeding birds, spend the vast majority of their time up near their nests. Makes sense. That's how they're living their lives. One thing that was surprising was that the adolescent herring gulls that were returning were also spending a ton of time up in the territorial areas of the island. These were birds that didn't have territories. Instead, they were sort of landing in a territory, waiting around, provoking aggression, sort of soaking up the vibes, getting driven away, and you can actually watch them across the landscape, a young bird with its brown plumage patches, land on a territory, get beat up a little bit, fly to the next territory, sort of ping pong around the island. And it really is tough to be a gull in a territorial area. There's a lot of fighting, there's physical violence, there's symbolic violence. And so this made me wonder what young gulls are doing up in these territorial areas, years before they start actually settling a territory, building a nest. There's no food up here. So what are they doing? There's 2 ways to think about a young bird needing to find a territory. The first one is that maybe these young birds just don't have space to be. Maybe the island is full. A young bird arrives back at the breeding colony. It's a great forager. It's ready to go. It's ready to try and raise young. But all the older birds have shown up first and they filled up all the space. And so young birds are just sort of crammed in different spots around the island. There's not enough space for young birds to have territories. We can actually test this at my field site on Kent Island. Way up north at the top of your screen are really low density beaches. A lot of empty space, a lot of room for territories. Up in those low density areas, about 4% of the herring gulls overall that you count are these adolescent birds, these 3-year-old birds with the brown in the wings and the black in the tail. If I go all the way down to the southern tip of the island where things are really dense, a lot of gulls screaming, a lot of gulls fighting, a lot of gulls pooping on me, there's still about 4% young birds. So these young birds have plenty of space to have a territory. They can fly up north to the empty beach, but they're not. Instead, I found most of them actually in the middle of the island at about medium density. These were birds that were around other birds, even though they had other space to be. So it's not that they couldn't find a territory or find a space to sit. It's something else. And this got me thinking more about what it takes for a young bird to actually have a territory. It takes more than space. Defending a territory in a herring gull is requires a lot of ritual. It requires a lot of symbol. Birds have very characteristic displays. Here's one. This is a choking display. Choking displays in herring gulls are used both to sort of establish a pair bond with your partner, to team up on a given spot, say, here's where our nest is going to be, here's where we're going to spend our time. And they're also used as a sort of symbolic border ritual. 2 gulls will display on the edges of their territory, defending this line, whether it's imaginary, whether they've settled a sort of border around a rock or a stick. They'll use a choking display and other behaviors like this to establish those territory boundaries. Young birds, when I watched them, didn't seem to do the choking display correctly. They often didn't do it in a context where they might have defended a space around them, and they didn't really respond to it effectively when other birds were being territorial. So it seems like young herring gulls, it's not that they don't have a place to be on the island, it's that they don't understand the social conventions of territoriality. This is a little bit puzzling because gulls don't learn social behaviors like a choking display from other gulls. If I took a herring gull and I put it in a box and I took it out 4 years later, it would probably have the physical tools to perform a choking display. It seems instead that rather than learning how to do a display like this, they need to learn what a display like this does. They need to understand not just how to perform a social behavior, but how to engage in a social convention. So physical growth is pretty complicated. Foraging is also pretty complicated. Imagine learning how to find and capture and handle food. But now we're in the world of social conventions. A young gull needs to establish social conventions to establish a territory, to lay an egg, to raise young. We're in an entire different social universe altogether when we're talking about the development of social conventions. Things get even more complicated when we turn to our next player here. This is a male long-tailed manakin. These plumages follow a similar track to the herring gulls. All the way on the left is about a 12-month-old bird. On the way on the right is a male in his adult breeding plumage. It takes about 4 or 5 years for this male to achieve his breeding plumage. A 4-year-old manakin in this species, the long-tailed manakin, is still not going to be able to breed. In fact, in long-tailed manakins, it takes males about 10 years to start reproducing. They don't contribute to raising young. Their only goal in life is to seduce a female to sire young, to contribute that sperm. That's their role in raising young. This is a bird that is, I don't even know if you can see this on the camera, it's about that big. It's like less than 20 grams. It grows to full size within days after hatching from an egg, and it's going to take this bird a decade to become a social and sexual adult. That's because the sex lives of these birds are extremely complicated. This is a long-tailed manakin display. This is what a male long-tailed manakin needs to do to sire young. On the left, you can see a female in her green plumage observing this display, and on the right, you can see 2 males. There's a lead dancer here. He's the one really trying to impress the female. He's the one who might get the chance to copulate. And there's a backup dancer, sometimes called a beta male. This is the one that's helping out the other male. Because in this species, the females will only prefer dances that males perform together. So one thing a young male needs to do in this species is find a dance partner. First, before that, they need to find a place to dance. They need to find a spot where other males are dancing. Then they need to become a backup dancer, this beta male, in a dance partnership at a particular dance site. Then they need to graduate to become an alpha male, and then they're competing with the other males at the other dance sites. And after they graduate to become that lead dancer, they need to actually refine their display, learn how to dance with their partner. This means that their social lives across that first decade are extremely complicated. The purpose of this figure is to look complicated. So you don't need to track individual interactions. What we're seeing here are birds, those are the circles, and interactions between birds over a decade of study of long-tailed manakins. You can see the different kinds of birds. In purple, there's the pre-definitive birds, those young males that are trying to find a place to dance. And then they become a definitive bird and they're entered into a social hierarchy. They found a spot. This is where I'm going to dance. And they work their way up that social hierarchy to become a backup dancer. And then they graduate to become a lead dancer. And then they're working for years and years to perform a successful dance for a female. Only then, usually after a decade, if not more, can this bird raise young. Females, by the way, begin breeding at about 2 years old in this species. So, like the herring gulls, we have a delay in reproduction in the males. It takes 10 years for male manakins to reproduce. Unlike the herring gulls, we now have a sexual difference. Females can start breeding right away at about 2 years old, 1 or 2. Males, it's taking 10 years precisely because they're navigating these social dynamics that the females don't navigate. So we're seeing the society restructure the life history of these birds. The purpose of this slide is to look purposefully boring because I find it fascinating how ornithologists sometimes slip these wonderful, bizarre facts into fairly dry, straight papers about mannequins. Don't tell Dave McDonald that I said that this paper was dry. It's a beautiful paper. So what this says is that the mating success of a male long-tailed mannequin, one of these breeding adult males, these lead dance partners, is correlated with their predecessor's dance at the same site. So if I'm a male and I'm performing a dance and I'm excellent, a female's going to visit and they're going to watch me lead a dance. I have my partner and we've worked for years to refine our dance, to calibrate our announcement songs, to calibrate our movements with one another. But the female's not just judging me. They're judging the previous dancers who danced at that spot. Maybe mannequins that danced years before me. Females have a loyalty and a memory to dance locations, not just individual dance teams. So now we're talking about a completely different universe of development altogether. Not only is a young male entering into a hierarchy to develop an opportunity to dance, to develop an opportunity to be a lead dancer, to develop his dance itself. Males are entering into an institution which is developing across generations. If you're a male entering into an institution that has a good history, and if you play a role in building the reputation of that institution, you're going to be more successful, and the generations of birds that come after you are going to be more successful. We can't pin down this kind of development to anything about the genetics or the physical nature of an individual bird, and not even the behavior of an individual bird. This is, again, an institution developing over multiple generations of birds that is determining how a young male mannequin can live its life. There's a surprising evolutionary twist to this story, which changes the dynamics of the situation a little bit. So young male mannequins have a lot that they need to do. They need to, again, find a place to dance, get the opportunity to dance at that location, develop their dance. It turns out that young male mannequins, in this species at least, have evolved a tool to help them do this. So these plumages I've talked about in terms of age, maybe 1 year old, 3 years old, 4 years old. But Dave McDonald had some dead mannequins and he stuffed them and he put them in front of other males. If you're a male and you're in this definitive adult breeding plumage and you're close to other males, you're going to get attacked. If you're in one of these younger plumages that signals your youth, you're going to get attacked less. So now we have a different kind of dynamic. Young males have development that they need to do. They need to be close to other males. They need to engage in cooperative relationships with other males, to find a dance partner, to navigate that hierarchy. And they've evolved a tool to do this. They've evolved a plumage that signals that they're young, but they're male, that they're engaged, but they're not competitive. This made me think about gulls. You can see a parallel track again, 1 year old, 3 years old, this definitive adult breeding plumage. It sort of surprised me to learn that nobody has ever explained these plumages. You'll learn a lot about gull plumages on Facebook. There's an entire sort of cottage industry of people taking wonderful pictures. Oh, here's the scapulars, here's the spotting on the tertials. These technical terms about where these feathers are and how they look on different species and different ages. But scientists have really not said anything much at all about why young birds have plumages. My hypothesis is that it's a lot like mannequins. Young male mannequins have evolved a tool to help with their development, that behavioral development, that social development, that sexual development. Young male mannequins need to enter into a society of dancers and dancing institutions. Young herring gulls need to enter into a society of breeding territories, the society of a seabird colony. And what we learned from Kent Island was that these males in this distinct plumage signaling precisely that they are young, but that they are socially engaged, have evolved a similar plumage to the mannequins. So my hypothesis, which I'm looking forward to testing in the coming years, is do these predefinitive plumages, these young plumages in herring gulls, play that role in development like they do in mannequins? Is this something that can help a young bird engage in that form of development? And again, now we have a strange feedback cycle with these plumages that we're seeing evolve over millions of years. On the one hand, we have society which tells young birds the sorts of things they need to do. A young mannequin enters into its society and he must dance if he wants to be an effective breeding adult. A young herring gull enters into a breeding colony. That's a society where they must learn how to establish a territory. They need to abide by certain social conventions to be an adult. And in response, we're seeing young birds over evolutionary time evolve plumages that retune the relationships in those societies. Young birds are thrust into society and they're evolving plumages that restructure slowly those societies. We have this vast feedback loop all taking place in the lives of young birds. I just picked 2 stories. They're 2 of my favorite stories about young birds, but we could have told hundreds more. There's all sorts of crazy kinds of development happening across birds. Cooperative family groups, hierarchies over carcasses, parrots trying to find nest cavities, birds establishing pair bonds that will last decades. I just picked 2 stories. And part of the problem is we don't know a lot about a lot of these other species because people don't often pay attention to young birds. They're not the breeding adults that have nests on our, we'll go out and we'll take a census, how many nests are there, click, click, click. Those are by definition the breeding birds. These young birds aren't often breeding. Or maybe it's really easy to scoop up an egg or scoop up a chick, take measurements on those. Those are the birds we can capture and manipulate. In the middle are these adolescent birds. They're off living their lives, engaging with societies, and we don't really know much about them. But every time we check, pretty weird. That's all I got. Thanks very much. I'm excited to look at the Q&A and talk further.
All right, thank you. Thank you, William. Thanks for joining us. And we'll take a seat here and answer some of the questions from the audience. All right, that was super engaging. Thank you so much. And it was so fun to see all your research photos as well in the field. So we have a few questions here from viewers. And one person was actually asking about on the herring gull's beak, what's a red dot?
So the red dot is one of these things that develops over time. I focus more on plumage, but in most species of birds, their legs will be maybe a little bit pale, and then as they enter their breeding age, they'll often become these vibrant, like orange-red colors. A herring gull bill starts out as sort of a pale, fleshy color, and over years, it will develop into this vibrant yellow with, as the listener said, this bright red dot. And Nico Tinbergen, who was a Nobel Prize winner who studied gulls for decades, actually kind of discovered the purpose of this, which is chicks will naturally peck at the red dot. And he thought about this by just sort of drawing shapes of different colors on sticks and putting them in front of their chicks and seeing like what stimulates what. And then he watched the adults as their bills were being pecked. And it seems like when the chicks peck the bills of the parents, that sort of cues the parents to regurgitate food. So it's part of this sort of signaling mechanism between parents and chicks to get a parent to, whether it's the chick sort of controlling the parent's behavior or the parent giving the chick an opportunity to indicate whether it's hungry or not, we don't quite know. But it's sort of this line of communication between adults and babies and herring gulls.
Fascinating. That's really cool. Let's see here. We've got some more questions coming in. In regards to the lucky mannequins, we had another guest who was wondering about the lifespan. Since it takes the birds 10 years in order to be able to reproduce as males, does it matter how long they live since they don't participate in rearing young?
Yeah, so this raises interesting and really complicated issue, which I won't get into too much, but it's an excellent question. Manakins and small tropical birds like manakins have pretty long lifespans. So male manakins might live for maybe 18 or 20 years. Most birds, manakins, are not die before they start reproducing. So there is this sort of correlation between how long do you live and how quickly do you need to start reproducing. If you look at like a shrew, grows really fast, breeds really young, dies really young. An elephant grows really slow, breeds in an older age, dies really old. The thing I'm interested in is how the sort of social and behavioral dynamics of something like a mannequin break that pattern. So here we have a bird that really doesn't live that long, maybe a decade or two. And certainly the males, I assume, if they're interested in reproducing, would prefer to reproduce at a younger age. It's just that they can't. So it's less that evolution has sort of tuned these male birds to behave in sort of the best way. And more, in my opinion, and based on the sort of perspective I have from working through these projects, it's more that the males simply have things that they must do because they live in a particular society.
Okay.
And that society creates a certain a social context, a sort of, they have to impress a female. And if it takes 10 years to impress a female and that's their only way of reproducing, they're going to follow the rules, right? And they have some tricks to do that, like these plumages, like these male-male cooperative relationships. But, there's no rule that says females need to prefer a kind of dance that gets males dancing faster, for example. From the female's perspective, as long as there are males that are there, if they're performing dances that they prefer, they'll mate with those males. That system is complicated and we don't understand it well, but there's plenty of male mannequins that die before they are 10 years old, and there's plenty that live to 10 years old and die without ever reproducing at all. So, yeah.
So is that kind of like the difference between like an R-selected and a K-selected species? There might be they might fit into its own category.
Yeah, there are these, like, going back into kind of 20th century evolutionary biology, you have this search for these big patterns. No, this is great. And this is what people think of. There's this deep intuition. People learn about it in, it's one of the first things you might learn about if you take an entry-level evolution class. And it certainly is true. You have, like you said, R-selected, like that's true, breed fast, die young. Or the K-selected, like that elephant, breed slow, live for a long time, invest in only a few offspring, but they're going to be really healthy, really strong offspring. I think my interest in this topic is precisely because when something like a breeding colony evolves in birds, or when something like a lek system evolves, these systems of sexual displays and sexual performance, when those things evolve in these lineages of birds, exactly what they're doing is sort of retuning those patterns. So you might look within mannequins and say all the species of mannequins have to get, have to dance in a certain way. There's a few exceptions to that. And then maybe the mannequins that live longer take a little longer to dance. Maybe the mannequins that live shorter take a little shorter. But if you compare a mannequin to a pigeon, even though it's substantially smaller, it's still going to take a lot longer to breed because it's entered in over evolutionary time to this really complicated social situation. So we have on the one hand these like big scale patterns, R selection, K selection, small, fast, big, slow. But then you have the evolution of things like territoriality, social conventions, dance displays that shift how those lines work across lineages. So it ends up being kind of hard when you start diving into individual stories about birds to get back to the big pattern, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And I, again, sit at the School of Environment, so getting the chance to talk about ecology and evolutionary biology is a treat and not necessarily in my wheelhouse. So thank you for that.
No, it's fascinating, and it's something I get into fights about all the time. It's an active area of conversation, I'd say.
Okay, so we have another question here about if you can say something about why some birds have a set of developmental plumages for both sexes, like gulls, while some are just for males. So like what we saw in like mannequins.
Yeah. So what we see first of all is that sexual difference emerging when there's a sexual difference in the process of development itself. So in herring gulls, and I'm sorry I skipped over some of these details, but both parents will help care for young, both parents will help defend a territory, both parents will play a role in choosing each other as mates. Okay. And so there's no asymmetry there in male or female, the sort of things that a young bird needs to do. There might be a little bit because a female might incur the cost of laying an egg, so that might add some additional energy or cost, or there might be some little differences. But by and large, a young bird, if you're a herring gull, needs to do what they need to do, whether they're male or female, whether they produce eggs or have testes. In mannequins, that developmental challenge is very different. So male mannequins have a long delay because it's only the males that need to get better at dancing. This is how I view it, at least. So females can go right ahead. They're building nests. They have other challenges. They have other things that they might need to do a better job at. And in fact, female mannequins are extraordinarily poorly tested, except at these dance sites. People really pay attention to birds as they show up. Obviously, flashy displays. You saw the birds dancing around. That's cool to watch. There's a lot of interesting things going on. But then the females will, observe a male, maybe choose to copulate and then fly off and never be seen again. So we don't know a heck of a lot about their lives, but they don't need to establish a dance partnership or find a dance. So that creates the sexual difference. The sexual difference in the developmental demand or obstacle or opportunity for a young bird creates the sort of different life history of the males versus females.
Okay.
We see this happening sort of convergently in all these lekking birds, these birds with really complicated male displays, and only in the males. So bowerbirds and birds of paradise, for example, the males will take a long time and the females will start reproducing immediately. And again, because that behavioral challenge, that social challenge is happening for the males, but not the females. And so in that context, if you follow those sorts of pathways, understanding the developmental demands, you can see that only the males might evolve a tool to develop if they're the only ones that are developing. Gets, as all these things do, a little more complicated because the young male mannequins actually look a heck of a lot like females.
Right.
So, and there's a sort of cottage industry of thinking about, are they mimicking females? We can say more about that. But so part of it is that the females don't necessarily, in mannequins, have a plumage to progress to. They reach their breeding plumage right away. It's just that the males have a couple more steps that they need to get to.
It's fascinating. It's really interesting.
A lot of moving pieces.
Yeah. I have more questions off the top of my head, but I want to get to our guests here. So we have another question about do adolescent birds also practice the vocalizations, such as the long call that they need in order to interact with a mate?
So a long call, I'm assuming, is a reference to this characteristic, like the trumpeting call of the herring gull. It's the thing you'll hear sometimes on the roof downtown in New Haven. But usually when you pull up on I won't do my impression of all the herring gull calls for you today. That's after the talk. But you'll hear it a lot on a breeding colony. As far as I know, in birds like herring gulls, they don't really develop those vocalizations or the physical capacity to perform those vocalizations. So it's not like a song, they aren't learning it. I've seen birds that looked by their plumage about 2 years old that have sort of a squeaky voice.
Mm-hmm.
They sounded a little bit like chicks. Mm-hmm. I've seen a bird that I know for a fact is about 3 months old with a really deep voice. It's like watching a toddler like walk around like this. And I wrote it down because I'm trying to keep track of these things. But for those first couple months or that first year, it might be that young herring gulls can't really perform those displays physically. Their syrinx is developing, or their body does grow and change a little bit in that first year. But for that second, third, fourth, fifth year, they probably are physically capable of performing that display. And that's where I get to this idea that it's less about the being able to perform the display and more about the context in which you perform it. What happens when I land next to someone else's nest and make a trumpet call? I get beat up. What happens when I trumpet call on an empty spot? Maybe other birds respond differently. Those are the kinds of things that I think are developing in herring gulls. It's a little bit tough to study, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have to band the birds? Are there certain ways you can follow them in your field season? And
yeah, so this is the main challenge, and I think the reason why people haven't studied a lot of these topics in this sort of adolescent period, which is it takes you band a bird when they're a chick, and you have to follow them for 3 or 4 or 10 years as you're tracing this process of development.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time, more than half of those birds are going to die. You'll never see them again. Maybe they're born on my island, but they end up breeding on another island, so I lose that data point. So it's actually been hard to kind of motivate these sorts of studies because, exactly like you said, it's hard to follow them through their life. The sort of thing I'm trying to do in my research is organize enough information to say we really do need to be looking at these things, because maybe it's worth it to band more chicks than you thought you needed, or maybe it's worth it to put a GPS tracker on a gull that you're pretty sure is going to die, but on the off chance you get it over those couple of years, you're going to learn something really new and really interesting. So these aren't the first things that people have gotten around to, but we're starting to sort of turn that way as, you know, we have better tools for monitoring birds, satellite tags. They're cheaper, they're more robust, they can last years. So we're like entering an era of the study of adolescent birds.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's exciting. Yeah. And I imagine, again, like the funding plus technology, there's a lot of barriers there, but it seems like you guys are at a threshold where
Yeah, exactly.
really
Yeah.
interesting research. Okay, and I see we're starting to get closer to the end of our hour here. And we have two questions that are roughly around the same topic about 2-year-old females. Let's see. So, so the female mannequins, going back to the mannequins, you said that female mannequins don't breed until they're 2. Are there any other social behaviors among females that might explain that delay? And then, do females have multiple partners as well?
So for the first question, I say 2 because that's like in long-tailed mannequins our best record. So the youngest female of a known age that was observed breeding was about 2 years old. So it could be that there's dynamics. It's hard to raise baby birds. Mannequins in particular are foraging in a way that's much easier than something like a herring gull. So they're not generalists. They don't have to, you know, catch a fish in the open water. They're finding fruit which wants to be eaten.
Mm-hmm.
So they you know, whether there's foraging development or maybe other challenges for females building nests, we're not sure. It's likely that you know, a female long-tailed mannequin that's about 12 months old can attempt reproduction.
Okay.
Might be that there's other things that they get experience with in terms of like incubating, for example. That gets into something interesting because you know, if you need experience incubating, the only way to get experience is to do something. So in the herring gull, we saw the only way to get experience around breeding territories is to be around breeding territories. It might be that for females, the only way to get experience with raising eggs is to try to raise eggs. So that there's different things that might develop after birds start breeding as well. But really, that question just comes down to, and both questions, the things that females are doing interacting with each other comes down to the fact that we haven't studied them well enough. Especially in these species where the males are really flashy and the females are, you know, green and not doing backflips.
Still a nice color.
I know, no, it's beautiful, and the young males look the same. So I've really grown fond of that green. But yeah, there's a ton that we still need to learn about these tropical birds, especially in the females.
Awesome, cool. Well, I think that's about it in terms of what we have time for today. And again, thank you everybody for joining us in the Zoomverse. And thank you, Liam, for joining us. If you enjoyed the talk, we are live streaming it to our social platforms. We're also going to be uploading the talk to our YouTube channel. So if you want to share it later on with your friends, please do so. Later on this fall, we are also continuing with our Research Spotlight series. So please keep an eye out for our next speaker, who is Dalton Mayer. He's from the Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences, and we'll be talking about fossil records of lizards in the American West, and that's on November 30th. And in the meantime, if you want to stay in touch with the broader Yale Peabody Museum, our mailing list sign up is on the bottom of our homepage, and we'll be sure to keep you in touch of all the upcoming events. So thank you again, Liam, for joining us.
Yeah.
And thank you, David, for being off screen, but managing the Q&A and technical sides of this. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Have a great night.